In the early hours of May 11, 2012, a family home in Derby, England, became the center of a tragedy that would shock the entire country. 6 children would lose their lives in a fire, and what initially looked like a devastating household accident would eventually be revealed as something far more disturbing. At the center of the story was Mick Philpott, a man whose complicated family life had already attracted public attention. Born in Derby in 1956, Philpott became known for fathering a remarkably large number of children with several women, but behind the image of a man surrounded by a huge family was a long history of violence, control, and unstable relationships. His earliest known pattern of abuse began when he was 19 and became involved with 15-year-old Kim Hill. What began as a relationship soon turned frightening, with Kim subjected to repeated violence and intimidation. The transcript describes incidents in which Philpott assaulted her over seemingly minor situations, including accusations of infidelity and jealousy over attention given to a baby she was caring for. For Kim, leaving was not simply a matter of ending a relationship. In July 1978, after 2 years of abuse, she finally found the courage to send Philpott a breakup letter. His response was terrifying. He went absent without permission from the army, broke into Kim's home, and attacked her and her mother. Both women survived, but Kim was left with severe physical and emotional trauma. Philpott was convicted of attempted murder and grievous bodily harm and sentenced to more than 7 years in prison, although he served only a little over 3 years before being released. Even afterward, the consequences of that violence did not simply disappear. The transcript states that Kim continued receiving counseling decades later, describing the lasting impact of what she had experienced. And yet, despite this history, Philpott would go on to build another family, then another, repeatedly entering relationships with vulnerable young women. The pattern would continue, becoming increasingly complicated until his household eventually included multiple women and numerous children living under one roof. After his release from prison, Philpott married Pamela and had 3 children with her. But the abusive behavior described in the transcript continued. Eventually, another relationship entered his life. In 1993, Philpott, then began a relationship with 14-year-old Heather Keogh. Heather eventually left her parents to be with him after turning 16, and the relationship produced 2 sons. According to the transcript, Heather experienced further abuse inside the relationship, including being punished for not having a daughter and being isolated from the household. She eventually escaped by climbing over a fence, but leaving did not immediately mean freedom from the consequences of the relationship. She temporarily lost custody of her children and had to fight a long legal battle before regaining it. Heather later described Philpott as someone who could initially appear charming before becoming controlling and violent. Her story was another indication of a disturbing pattern. Young women entering Philpott's life during vulnerable periods, only to find themselves trapped in relationships where his control became increasingly difficult to escape. Then, in 2000, Philpott met a teenage mother who had recently left an abusive relationship. At first, he appeared to her as a protector. He moved in with her, took responsibility for her young son, and proposed after the birth of their first child, Jade. But the household would soon become much more complicated. The following year, Philpott began another relationship with Lisa Willis, a 16-year-old orphan who was also a young mother. Lisa eventually moved into the same household with Philpott and Meard. Surprisingly, the 2 women became close, with Lisa reportedly treating Meard's children as her own. By 2003, Philpott had married Meard, while Lisa remained part of the household, and the family continued growing. 11 children were eventually living in a 3-bedroom council house. While the transcript says Philpott remained unemployed and relied on the women's earnings and government benefits, he also openly argued that his large family entitled him to better housing and greater assistance. Philpott did not keep his unusual family arrangement hidden from the public. In fact, he appeared eager to defend it. In 2007, he appeared on The Jeremy Kyle Show, where he discussed his unemployment, criminal record, relationships, and large family. He presented himself as someone who had been unfairly treated and argued that his circumstances made finding work difficult. He also publicly defended the unconventional arrangement involving Meard and Lisa, showing little concern about what strangers thought of his household. The media attention only increased after reports that he was receiving substantial government benefits. Philpott wanted a larger council home for the growing family, but his attempts to gain public sympathy did not produce the result he wanted. Another documentary that same year offered an even more revealing picture. A conservative MP spent time observing his lifestyle and reportedly found that Philpott repeatedly failed to follow through with employment opportunities. He was also shown living in a caravan in the garden, while Meard and Lisa alternated nights with him. Two outsiders. The household could appear bizarre but strangely functional. People in the community sometimes defended Philpott and said the negative public image did not reflect the man they knew, but behind the doors of that crowded home, tensions were building. The transcript describes increasing conflict between Philpott, Meard, and Lisa, particularly as relationships and control inside the household became more strained. In 2010, Philpott received a police caution after assaulting Meard. Lisa was also subjected to controlling and abusive behavior, and by February 2012 she had reached a breaking point. She told Meard that she was taking her 5 children swimming, but instead left the household and moved in with her sister. According to the transcript, this was the only way Lisa felt she could leave without provoking a confrontation. Her departure transformed the already unstable household into something even more dangerous, because Philpott was now facing a custody battle over the children he had been claiming as part of his family. 3 months after Lisa left, Philpott was still angry and involved in the custody dispute. What happened next would become the central horror of the entire case. According to the prosecution evidence described in the transcript, Philpott, Meard, and a family friend named Paul Mosley developed a plan to set fire to the family home while the children were inside. The intention, as presented in the case, was not supposedly to kill the children but to create the appearance that Lisa had endangered them, allowing Philpott to portray himself as the father who had heroically rescued his children and potentially strengthened his position in the custody battle. The plan was also connected to the family's financial circumstances, because gaining custody could mean additional benefits and potentially a larger council house. The intended scenario depended on the fire being controlled enough for Philpott to enter and rescue the children. But fires do not follow scripts, and the plan that had been imagined as a way to manipulate a custody dispute would become an irreversible catastrophe. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, on May 11, 2012, the fire was started at the house. It spread much faster than those involved had apparently expected. Within minutes, the situation was beyond anyone's control. 6 children were trapped inside. Jade, Jaden, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden died at the scene, while their 13-year-old half-brother Dwayne died in hospital 2 days later. Investigators determined that the fire had been deliberately started using petrol beneath the letterbox and classified the deaths as murder during the initial investigation. The temperatures recorded upstairs were extreme, leaving little chance for those trapped in the bedrooms to survive. But behind those terrible numbers were 6 individual children, each with a personality, a family, and a life that had barely begun. Jade was remembered as intelligent and well-regarded at school. Jaden was described as cheerful and polite. Another young sibling was remembered for loving affection from family and friends, while Jack was described as quiet and a delight to be around. Jesse was known as a loud personality in the family, and Dwayne, the oldest victim, at only 13, was remembered as caring and protective toward his younger siblings. The morning after the fire, the reality of what had happened began to settle over the community. People who had known the family struggled to understand how 6 children could have died inside their own home. Some neighbors had defended Philpott before the tragedy, believing that, whatever his faults were, he loved his children. One local man even organized a charity effort to help pay for the children's funerals. Standing outside the burned home, he spoke emotionally about Philpott and insisted that mistakes did not mean someone deserved such a tragedy. That reaction is important because it shows how convincing Philpott's public image could be. Even people who knew about his controversial lifestyle did not immediately imagine that the father at the center of their community could be connected to the deaths of his own children. But investigators were beginning to notice details that did not fit the image of a devastated father. Witnesses reported behavior they considered unusual, and his conduct during visits connected to the children's deaths raised further questions. Then came the press conference. Philpott and Meard appeared before cameras, thanking the community and speaking about the family's loss. Philpott also discussed the decision to donate Dwayne's organs, presenting an image of grief and gratitude while asking for privacy. Yet police suspicions were growing rather than disappearing. Investigators noted behavior they considered inappropriate, including Philpott's interaction with a female police officer. Soon, physical evidence began connecting the family to the fire. A petrol container and glove were discovered near the house, while forensic investigators later found petrol on clothing belonging to Philpott, Meard, and Mosley. Police then began gathering evidence through recorded conversations, and those recordings would prove crucial. In them, investigators heard statements suggesting that the fire had not been the simple tragedy the public initially believed. The investigation was moving from the question of what caused the fire to the much more disturbing question of who had planned it and why. As investigators listened more closely to the recorded conversations, the story began to unravel. Philpott could be heard discussing the events in ways that suggested he understood the consequences of what had happened, while also trying to maintain the explanation that the fire had been unintended. In one recording, he was heard referring to the loss of the children as his fault, while elsewhere the conversations contained attempts to maintain a consistent version of events. Investigators also discovered an unused ladder at the rear of the property, a detail that appeared particularly significant because the original plan had supposedly involved Philpott entering the burning house and rescuing the children, instead of becoming the heroic father he had imagined himself to be. He was now at the center of a police investigation into the deaths of 6 children. The forensic evidence, recorded conversations, and inconsistencies were beginning to form a picture that was almost impossible to ignore. The fire had not simply been a tragedy. It had emerged from a plan designed to manipulate a custody dispute, and 6 children had paid the ultimate price for the adults' decisions. The investigation also exposed just how complicated the relationships surrounding Philpott had become. Paul Mosley, the family friend involved in the plan, was later questioned about his role, and police believed that Philpott had taken steps to keep him loyal. The recordings contained disturbing conversations between those involved, including admissions and statements that prosecutors could use to establish what had happened before and after the fire. What had once looked like a chaotic family situation was now being examined as a deliberate sequence of choices. Philpott had wanted Lisa blamed, wanted custody of the children, and wanted the consequences of that custody battle to benefit him. Yet the plan had gone catastrophically wrong. The children, who were supposed to become part of a carefully staged rescue, had instead become victims. By the time police arrested Philpott and Meard on suspicion of murder on May 28, 2012, the investigation had already moved far beyond the original question of whether the fire was accidental. 2 days later, they were formally charged. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced an important distinction. The evidence showed that Philpott, Meard, and Mosley had participated in a plan involving the deliberate setting of the fire, but establishing their exact intentions became central to the legal outcome. The murder charges were eventually reduced to manslaughter. The evidence indicated that the adults had intended to create a situation in which Lisa would be blamed for endangering the children, rather than deliberately planning the children's deaths. But that distinction did nothing to lessen the devastation of what had happened. The prosecution's case rested on the idea that the fire was a planned act carried out for selfish reasons, with custody, financial benefits, and housing among the motivations described in the transcript. 6 children died because adults had decided that manipulating a family dispute was worth taking an extraordinary risk with their lives. The tragedy was not simply that the plan failed. The tragedy was that the children had been placed inside the plan at all. On April 2, 2013, the court delivered its verdict. Philpott, Meard, and Paul Mosley were all found guilty of manslaughter in connection with the deaths of the 6 children. Philpott received a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years. Meard and Mosley each received 17-year sentences, with minimum terms of 8.5 years. Meard later appealed her sentence, arguing against the punishment imposed on her, but the Court of Appeal rejected the challenge. The judges emphasized the enormous harm caused and pointed to evidence that Meard had participated in the setting of the fire, including petrol found on her clothing. They also concluded that the fire was not a spontaneous act and that she had continued to conceal the truth after her arrest. The sentencing remarks described the responsibility a mother has toward her children, and concluded that Meard had placed her relationship with Philpott above that responsibility for the families and the community. However, no sentence could restore the 6 lives that had been lost. The years that followed brought another painful chapter. In November 2020, Meard was released after serving roughly half of her sentence and became eligible for release on license. According to the transcript, she was taken to a halfway house under a new identity intended to protect her. Her release generated anger and disbelief among crime prevention advocates, some of whom argued that people responsible for crimes of this magnitude should serve their full sentences. Paul Mosley was released in May 2021 after serving half of his sentence, although he later returned to prison in 2022 after breaching the conditions of his parole. He was released again in November 2023. After a parole panel concluded that continued imprisonment was no longer necessary for public protection. The legal process had therefore reached a point where 2 of the 3 people convicted in connection with the children's deaths were no longer behind bars. Yet for the families, the community, and anyone who remembered the case, freedom could never erase what had happened inside that house. Phil, meanwhile, remained imprisoned, serving the minimum portion of his life sentence. Looking back across his history, the case appeared less like an isolated moment of madness and more like the culmination of years of destructive behavior. The transcript describes a man who had repeatedly been accused of abusing and controlling women, who had built an unusually large household, and who had publicly presented himself as a devoted father while pursuing financial and personal interests. Connected to his family, his public image and private behavior existed in stark contrast. For years, people around him had seen different pieces of that contradiction, without necessarily seeing the complete picture. The 6 deaths forced everything into the open. The children were no longer statistics in a custody dispute or names in a newspaper story. They were 6 young lives that had been cut short, and the case left behind a question that remains difficult to escape. How could the adults responsible for protecting them have allowed their own conflicts and ambitions to become more important than the safety of the children? What makes the Philpott case especially disturbing is not simply the number of people involved, but the way the children became entangled in the adults' world. The transcript portrays a household in which relationships, money, housing, custody, control, and public image had become deeply connected. Philpott's history showed repeated patterns of domination, while his later family life placed numerous children inside an environment where adult conflicts could directly affect them. By 2012, Lisa had left because she wanted to escape that environment, and the custody dispute that followed became the immediate background to the fire. Instead of allowing the legal system to determine custody, the adults involved attempted to manipulate events themselves. Their plan depended on controlling a dangerous situation, and that assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The children had no control over the argument between the adults, no control over the custody dispute, and no understanding that their home had become part of a plan that could put their lives at risk. Their only connection to the tragedy was that they were there. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking part of the entire story. Each of those children had been known by the people around them for something ordinary and human: a smile, a quiet personality, a love of affection, a sense of humor, intelligence, or the instinct to protect younger siblings. Duane, only 13, was remembered as a caring older brother who looked after the children around him. The younger children were remembered through the small details that make a life feel real rather than historical. Those memories matter because they remind us that the victims were never simply part of Philpott's enormous family. They were individuals with their own personalities and futures. When the fire took them, it did not simply end 6 names on a family tree. It erased 6 futures that had not yet had the chance to unfold. The story of Mick Philpott ultimately became a case about far more than one fire. It exposed a long history of abuse, control, manipulation, and relationships in which vulnerable people were repeatedly drawn into his orbit. It revealed how a public image can sometimes hide realities that are much darker behind closed doors. It also demonstrated how decisions made for selfish reasons can create consequences that can never be undone. The fire was intended, according to the evidence described in the transcript, to manipulate a custody battle and potentially improve Philpott's circumstances. Instead, it destroyed the very family he claimed to be fighting for. The courts eventually held Philpott, Meard, and Mosley responsible through manslaughter convictions, but no verdict could restore Jade, Jaden, Jack, Jesse, and Duane. Their names remain attached to a tragedy that began with adults trying to control a situation that should never have been placed at risk. Years later, the most difficult question is not simply what happened, because investigators and courts established the central facts. The harder question is whether the deaths could have been prevented if earlier warning signs had been taken more seriously. Philpott had already been convicted of a violent attack decades earlier. His later relationships contained further allegations of abuse and control. Yet he continued building the public identity of a father and family man, eventually receiving enormous attention for his unusual household and demands for greater support. The 6 children who died had no voice in any of those decisions. Their lives ended because the adults around them made choices they could never take back. And that is where this case leaves us, not with a satisfying ending, but with a painful reminder that children depend completely on the adults responsible for them. When that responsibility is replaced by control, greed, revenge, or personal ambition, the consequences can be irreversible.